or like their jobs or something, they're definitely advocating for Tamil and for the justice for genocide, right? But I feel like these kind of conferences kind of brings everyone together, and like you're saying, I think the Tamil community probably could do a lot more of these and support the young people because like as the older generation, they've lived through these firsthand experiences and they have this passion for it. But as the Tamil like youth diaspora, like living in the diaspora, it's I think like having this passion and like being able to like advocate for it. I think that we should do more of these things and appreciate it, and definitely it'll bring light to those things. Like I was inside and I was looking at the paper, and there's so many research papers, right, that I didn't know about till I got here. So yeah.
And how do you feel that we could encourage parents to bring out their students and just enlighten them about what happened and how they could help and how they could go back home and do, you know, some work back home and helping other individuals with widows and children without parents and orphans? How could we help them out, and how could we get parents to take part in that?
So I feel that like getting parents involved into what you as like young people do, letting them know what you're doing, bringing them to these events or something like that will help them because most of our parents might not be too involved in these things. They just want us to do school. They just want us to, you know, like situation. I feel like that would make a big difference.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Abby, for coming out today, and we'll wrap this up. Thank you. I never asked that question.
What I'm really looking at is the elusiveness of a Sri Lankan past and present. And when I say Sri Lankan, I mean this sort of civic notion of nationhood, whereby the values of nationhood are seen as more inclusive, like language, citizenship rights, obligations, and so on and so forth. Basically values that can be learned, that can be ascribed, and are seen thus as more inclusive, as compared to ethnic values that are usually linked to a shared heritage and more exclusive myths and symbols, and so on and so forth. Of course, any civic values at all, but that's kind of beyond my talk. Why? Nope. Oh, yeah. So why do I look at history textbooks? Basically, as Dave said, the diffusion of nationalism derives its power by being widely shared by a lot of people. And textbooks are an important part of the socialization process. They are basically how young future citizens learn about the values that are seen as important. So they're both a tool of spreading nationalism, and they're also a representation of the kind of knowledge that should be taught, that should be learned. History, then, in particular, is an important subject because it provides this collective memory to an idea and look like, or should they look like once the textbooks come out. Now, given the constraints on time, I won't be able to talk about all the dimensions, but I'm going to focus on, first of all, these kind of questions. So who is this nation that the textbooks talk about, whose history we talk about? And it becomes very clear very quickly that, of course, while they do talk about a Sri Lankan nation, they really look at a Sindhese Buddhist modern nation. And as such, not only creating this continuity between modern-day Sri Lanka and past Sindhese kingdoms, but also reinforcing the use of ethnic literature. I looked a lot at how the textbooks provide very selective storylines. They're very selective in the events they cover, also in the heroes they cover. So they focus very much on Sindhese kings, Sindhese politicians, and Tamils and Muslims feature very, very rarely, which creates the sense of a Sinhalese history. Also, I put up the picture of Vijaya here, who herself. And lastly, the role of Buddhism, which is very important for the textbooks, and again, is a major driver of exclusivity, I think, whereby Buddhism is not only constructed as part of national identity, but a way the textbooks tell the students that, well, really only Buddhists can rule the country because Buddhist rulers, they're compared to wish-conferring trees, while non-Buddhists are seen as poisonous trees, sending a very strong message, or very clear message, that really the only people who should rule Sri Lanka. Symbol that's presented here as the major source of political legitimacy in the past, and by extension in the present as well. That brings us to the question, so behavior linked to the Indian invasions, South-Indian invasions. So they're seen as strangers, as outsiders, as basically not full part of the Sinhalese or Sri Lankan nation. Then, of course, we have instances of implicit and explicit negative depiction between the South Indians and the Tamils. That negative depictions of the South Indians would perhaps by many readers be taken as negative images of the Tamils, and there is quite a lot of Indians and Buddhist leader who lost the independence of the country, according to textbooks, which of course adds to the ideas that the readers should have about non-Sinhalese, non-Buddhists, and their ability to rule the country. So briefly, how does the end of the war fit into this kind of past? First, as it's perhaps felt by the Tamil communities after defeat of the LTTE, versus the victor's peace, which is driven and perpetuated by the Sri Lankan government. And this sort of the space that is created or that is closed after the end of the war for reconciliation, for political reform, because it is a victor's peace, that tells us a lot about the remembering and forgetting from the majority community's perspective, limiting the space for other communities to add to the end of the war as a historical moment, and this might actually become official history. So I looked a bit at how this exclusive memory comes about, not in the textbooks, of course, because they don't cover any history after 1972, which in itself I think is interesting. They completely gloss over the conflict and the war as such. But we see after 2009 in the official discourses, which are full of the same historical narratives that the textbooks also perpetuate, the historicity of the victory. So, as I said, the victory is framed within the continuation of triumphalism, which of course is part of how the victory is framed, and the victimization of the Tamil community, importantly in these narratives not as a victim of repressive politics of the governments over decades, but as a victim of the LTTE, with the government having been the liberators of the Tamil community, which I think seriously limits the space in how far the Tamil community can express their grievances, as opposed to the victors who are seen as this benevolent, well, we saved you and you shouldn't really complain kind of way. So to conclude, again, this question whereby the textbooks should provide this tool to present or to construct a national cohesion, national integrity, national unity, harmony and peace. It's all very positive, very grand goals, but as long as the division of nationhood and it effectively marginalizes and silences minority communities both in the past and the present, because myths and legends are continues to be presented as facts, as truths, instead of fostering a more critical engagement with history that provides space for all communities to participate in the shaping of history. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I think our last speaker, Guru Paran, is going to be talking to us, I believe, via... Guru Paran, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. But my presentation today would be from an activist perspective, thinking about it like an academic. So, so it would be more of it'll be prescription. It'll be prescription heavy, so to speak, towards the end at least. And so, if I could be pardoned for that. The topic that I've taken, as you can see in the program schedule, looks at trying to contextualize the right to self-determination in the post-war context. And I want to push forward this idea of how the right to self-determination in the post-war context. Now, as you know, the Constitutional Assembly process towards drafting a new constitution hit a roadblock with the local government election results in January. And despite what Minister Mandla Samaravira might say, particularly what he said in Parliament, that the reform process is not yet dead, and that the process will continue. For all intents and purposes, it does look like the constitutional process won't move any forward. In fact, some of us actually fear that if the constitutional process does move forward, that the UNP particularly will be interested in appeasing the singular Buddhist majority a lot more, and might not even agree to the very little that you find in the Constitution. Now, I don't want to take your time by offering a detailed analysis of what is there in the interim report of the Steering Committee of the Constitutional Assembly that put its report out in December last year. But to say that there is absolutely no, if you read the document, and particularly, and I urge for those who are trying to understand what is there in the interim report of the Constitutional Assembly report, to read the annexures where you find the different political parties commenting on the interim report. It is very clear that particularly the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, both the wings, both under whatever is left with Maithripala Sirisena and Mahinda Rajapaksa, do not want to move away from a very hardcore understanding of what a unitary state constitutes. So even before the local government elections, for me, the constitutional project was going nowhere. And the problem is that the Tamils are being trying. I mean, the pressure is on the Tamils to compromise, right? The do-gooders on the part of the international community, the Colombo civil society included, want the Tamils to compromise and understand the fact that those do-gooders, in their perspective in the government, won't be able to do much because of pressure from the singular Buddhist vote base. So today the debate is not even on federalism. Today is the interim report is really a debate where the Tamils are being asked to take up a form of a unitary state and experiment with it in the name of a political solution. I think we need to be very careful about that. But we are living in a situation where the discourse is definitely not internal self-determination. The discourse is not definitely federalism. The discourse is about how you make sure that the Tamil demand can be put within a framework that of those whom the international actors in the South prefer, by which I mean the UNP and the current ruling dispensation. How do you reorient the demands of the Tamil people to fit within the narrative? So really on the question of self-determination, there is very little progress, and there is very little expectation that we can have for any sort of progress internally within Sri Lanka. Now you turn to the accountability front, accountability and justice. I have right from the beginning characterized the Sri Sena Wickramasinghe government's approach to accountability issues and transitional justice and reconciliation matters as a foreign policy management issue. It has always been a foreign policy management issue for them, not really an issue that they take to heart as an integral part of an agenda that they perceive for a future imprisons, which in itself is a structure that is fundamentally weak. Because I mean, if one reads like I do, Resolution 31 of the UN Human Rights Council resolution of 2015, I think the resolution speaks of a hybrid process, not just a hybrid code, but also a hybrid process. And in that sense, any institution, I think Geneva is frozen. The Tamils must realize that, and I've said this in the past a number of times, both in the homeland and abroad, that the approach that the Tamil activists have taken, where we have spent so much of energy in Geneva, is really not working. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be putting efforts at lobbying and advocating our position in Geneva, but I think on the accountability front, that we've expended our sort of energy almost entirely, almost mostly towards Geneva. That we are probably now finding it difficult to identify alternative pathways through which this struggle can be taken forward. So if that is the situation, I'm happy to answer any sort of questions about these very summarized questions that I've taken on these two issues. There is really no movement, and there is no real prospect for any further movement on these issues. So how should Tamils deal with the situation? And I think here we need to look at the recent results, and I think the local government results tell us an important lesson that we all must be that we must learn from. Now, for example, if you compare the votes that the Tamil nationalist parties, by which I mean the Tamil National Alliance, the Tamil National People's Front, and the TULF, which included Suresh Premachandran's EPRLF, got, there was a reduction of at least 8% of votes that these parties collectively got compared with the general elections. And if you look at the eastern province, there's been a reduction of at least 9% of vote share. And if you carefully look at it, in Kilinochchi and Mullaitivu, so for example, the general election of 2015, the vote share of the Tamil nationalist parties, the TNPF, TNA, and Suresh, of course, was with TNA at the time, was 79% of the vote in the general elections, and it has come down to 54%. So that's a loss of 25% of votes to Tamil nationalist parties in Kilinochchi, a loss of 22% of votes from 72% to 50% in Mullaitivu, and in Mannar, a loss of votes from 58 to 39%. Now, collectively, Kilinochchi, Mullaitivu, and Mannar are called the Vanni electoral district, and this was the theatre of the last phase of the war. So what is happening? I mean, this is where I think Tamil nationalist activists and political parties, we have to be very careful that if our self-determination narrative, if the kind of self-determination narrative that we are pursuing is not delivering results, if people are not hopeful that the kind of self-determination politics is being pursued, I think if parties that are interested in self-determination, if Tamil political activists and parties that are interested in self-determination, they need to rethink their agenda of self-determination in the post-war context. And this is why I have, in the past as well, emphasized that we need to look at how we reorient our policies so that Tamil self-determination politics responds to the dire need on the ground as well. Now, for this, I think, and I'll come. I know that the conference itself is running a little late, and I myself don't have much of time. So let me throw this idea out, and then probably, if there are people who are interested in this idea, engage with any questions that you might have. Organizational setups, which I call a parallel state. What do I mean by a parallel state? So you set up institutions and organizations parallel to the state, outside of the state structure, through which you can address the day-to-day suffering of the people, survivalist issues that the Tamil community as a whole faces. And I won't detail it out. I'm sure this audience is quite aware of the terrible plight that the Tamil people are in. And through the creation of the running of these organizations, keep the idea of a Tamil nation alive through these parallel institutions. That in a sense, I'm arguing that it should be possible to make the Sri Lankan state irrelevant in the north and east, right? And it is only by making Sri Lankan institutions irrelevant in the north and east, and by creating self-autonomous governmental institutions of our own, parallel and outside the state, are we going to address the plight of the people while pursuing an agenda where we keep our larger goals of self-determination alive. And I think this is true also in the transitional justice front. For example, we need to look at whether we initiate parallel processes of people's tribunals back in the homeland, look at initiatives that systematically and concretely preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide committed during the war, look at initiatives relating to memorialization. So, for example, I was in a conversation with a wide cross-section of civil society organization and student movements here about, by the next year at least, for us to start on a program that looks at institutionalizing memory efforts towards 18 May 2019, the 10th anniversary of the end of the war. So all of this would mean that the Tamil community needs to self-discipline itself organizationally. I mean, one of the things that the LTP was very good about, and that they showed through their de facto state entities and institutions that they built up, is that they showed that Tamils can be good at institution building. But unfortunately, outside of the LTP, and if you look at the post-war context, the way in which we dealt the last 9 years, institution building is definitely not something that the Tamils can be proud of. So I think there is a lot that we need to invest in institution building on a wide, on all sorts of subjects, from fisheries to agriculture to memorialization initiatives, and connect these organizations in a way. And if people are looking for a parallel for other societies that have done it, take for example in Kosovo between 1988 and 1992, when Serbia abolished autonomous institutions there in the former Yugoslavia, they managed to run parallel institutions that supported their own schools, their own education, their own healthcare, so on and so forth, by setting up these parallel institutions in support of the Albanian diaspora spread around the world. And again, a more recent example is the Kurdish initiative. Now, Ken Ross has written extensively about this, about how small democratic assemblies in Kurdistan are being experimented as local level, a small scale sort of democratic assemblies through which we appropriate self-government to ourselves without wasting time with the larger state trying to deliver us with self-government. We take our own sort of steps towards establishing that space for self-government. And I think it is only through that sort of initiatives which are linked to each other, which are driven by a larger narrative and philosophy, that we can keep the hopes that the Tamils will be able to exercise the right to self-government. So the argument that I'm making today is that the Tamils need to step forward, step outside the box in a sense, and think about the right to self-determination outside the nation-state context. Now, outside the nation-state context here doesn't mean a separate state, right? It can mean a separate state. I'm not ruling it out, but I'm saying that it should be possible through this parallel state idea that I'm proposing to think about ways in which we self-determine our own affairs through institutional collaborations, institutional imagination outside and parallel to the Sri Lankan state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guru. Would it be okay for you to stay online?
Sure.
Can I just ask Peter and Mimi as well, just to come up to the stage? I don't know how much time we have for Q&A. I have a number of questions for all of the speakers, and we'll